All right, so are you ready to jump into some Ivorian politics?
I'm ready.
Great, because today we're taking a deep dive into this pretty wild interview with Laurent Gbagbo.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy was the president of the Ivory Coast,
Right.
went to trial at the International Criminal Court,
Uh-huh.
and now at 80 years old, he's trying to get back into the presidency.
Yeah, he's a figure who, people have very strong feelings about him. Some positive, some very negative.
Yeah.
A lot of people see him as someone who really defended the Ivory Coast, but others see him as a divisive figure.
Yeah, for sure.
But this interview, I think, gives us a really good look into his perspective.
Yeah.
And also sheds some light on some pretty controversial stuff that happened in the Ivory Coast recently.
Yeah, I mean, there's some serious stuff in here.
Yeah.
Accusations of France, like meddling in the elections there.
Uh-huh.
This weird €3 million payment to former French President Jacques Chirac.
Right.
And, I mean, even his ideas about what makes a coup, like, good versus bad.
Yeah.
It's just wild.
It really is. It's like, what does that even mean?
I know, right?
Like, how do you define that?
It makes you think about how power really works
Right.
in the Ivory Coast and on, like, a global scale.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that really surprised me
Yeah.
was when Gbagbo said he was pressured to, like, step down during the 2010 election.
Yeah.
Especially by, like, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy.
Right. He even says that he was offered bribes to concede.
Yeah, that was crazy to me.
I know.
He didn't really give, like, specific names
Yeah.
or, like, hard proof or anything.
No.
But he definitely, like, paints this picture of shady dealings and foreign powers, like, messing around in Ivorian affairs.
Right.
Do you think this connects to those accusations about him robbing the BCEAO,
Oh, absolutely.
like the Central Bank of West African States?
Yes. During that whole post-election crisis.
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with the BCEAO, it's basically like the financial center of West Africa.
Right. It's hugely important.
Yeah, and what Gbagbo did had a huge impact on the Ivory Coast's economy.
Absolutely.
He says he didn't rob the bank, though.
Yeah. He claims that he nationalized it to make sure that civil servants would get paid.
Right, during all the chaos.
Yeah. It was a really unstable time.
Totally. So he's basically arguing that it was necessary
Yeah.
to stop an economic collapse.
Uh-huh.
And he says the charges against him are, like, politically motivated.
Yeah. Like a smear campaign to get him out.
Totally. And it seems like he's hinting that there's this link between what happened and his refusal to admit defeat in the 2010 election.
Right.
He claims that he stood up to all this international pressure,
Yeah.
but, like, at what cost?
Right. What was the price of that?
It makes you wonder about who really has the power.
For sure.
This idea that these outside forces, especially France,
Uh-huh.
are, like, shaping Ivorian politics
Hmm.
is something that comes up a lot with Gbagbo, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a recurring theme for him, and it's something that many people in the Ivory Coast and across Africa relate to, this idea that colonialism still has a hold on them in different ways.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about another controversial thing in this interview.
Okay.
The €3 million payment to Jacques Chirac
Yeah,
when Chirac was president of France.
right.
I mean, the crazy thing is that Gbagbo says he did it because Chirac asked him to.
Right.
And then later on, Chirac supported the rebellion against Gbagbo.
During the post-election process.
It's pretty ironic, right?
Totally.
Makes you think about what their relationship was really like
Yeah,
and why this money was being moved around.
totally. And then Gbagbo mentions another similar deal
Oh, yeah.
with a different African leader, but he won't say who it was.
Right. It's like a cliffhanger.
I know, right?
Yeah.
This whole thing raises some serious questions about how international diplomacy actually works behind the scenes,
Behind closed doors.
Yeah, like what role does money and influence play in all this?
Yeah.
Especially in Africa.
Right. Do they really have any say?
If all this is true,
Yeah.
it could change how we understand these relationships in the region. Absolutely. I think it's really important to remember, though,
Yeah.
that we're hearing Gbagbo's side of the story.
Of course.
So it's important to consider other viewpoints and evidence before we make up our minds.
Right. For sure.
Don't jump to conclusions.
So let's switch gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about Gbagbo's vision for Africa.
Right.
He's a big supporter of Pan-Africanism,
Yes.
this idea of a unified and powerful African continent.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also really critical of some of the institutions that are already in place,
Right.
like ECOWAS.
Right. The Economic Community of West African States.
Yeah, exactly. He sees them as being pretty ineffective.
Yeah. Especially when it comes to dealing with security issues.
Yeah, like the rise of all these militant groups
Right.
and how unstable the Sahel region is.
Exactly. He points to those as examples of their failures.
So instead, he supports the AES.
Right, the Alliance of African States of the Sahel.
Yeah, which he thinks is a better solution.
Yeah, he sees it as more legitimate and effective.
Right. And just for those who might not know, the AES is basically a more focused alliance.
Yeah.
That's all about addressing the security problems in the Sahel region.
Uh-huh.
So it's not as broad as ECOWAS, which is more about economic stuff.
Right, it's more targeted.
Yeah, Gbagbo seems to think it's just more practical.
Yeah, and this all connects back to his bigger point
Uh-huh.
about African nations taking charge of their own affairs,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to security.
He's got some strong opinions about how African countries should handle international relations.
Yeah, he's not shy about that.
He says African countries should fund their own organizations
Right.
and rely less on global powers like the EU and China.
Yeah, he's all about independence and self-determination for Africa.
It's like a call for a more assertive Africa
Yeah,
that sets its own path.
right.
And it really resonates with a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
who feel like African nations have been too dependent on others for way too long.
Yeah, they feel like they've been taken advantage of.
Right. This is where things get a little tricky, though.
Okay.
Gbagbo's ideas about leadership and democracy
Mm-hmm.
are, well,
They're interesting.
yeah, let's just say nuanced.
Yeah.
He actually says there's a difference between good and bad coups.
Right.
But it's like, wait, what?
You'd think that would be a touchy subject for him,
I know, right?
considering how he was removed from power.
Yeah, it's pretty chaotic.
It was. But he argues that violating the Constitution's term limits is basically a civil coup.
So he's saying even if it looks legal,
Yeah.
holding on to power for too long
Right.
is betraying democracy.
Uh-huh.
He even defends working with leaders who got their power through military coups.
Yeah, and he points out what he sees as Western hypocrisy.
They pick and choose which coups they condemn.
Exactly.
It's like he feels like the West has double standards when it comes to judging African leaders.
Right.
And he suggests that their condemnations are often based on what's convenient for them politically, rather than some genuine commitment to democracy.
It's all about their own interests.
And that leads us to maybe the most controversial part of Gbagbo's political philosophy.
What's that?
He'll work with anyone,
Oh, wow.
no matter how they got into power,
Yeah.
as long as it benefits the Ivory Coast.
So is that like pragmatism?
Yeah.
Or is that a slippery slope?
It's hard to say.
It really is. Some people see it as being smart,
Yeah.
and others see it as dangerous.
Yeah, like he's willing to compromise with authoritarianism.
Right.
I mean, Gbagbo's story is full of these complexities
It really
and
is.
contradictions.
Yeah.
It's definitely made me rethink some of my own ideas about African politics.
That's what I love about looking into people like Gbagbo.
Yeah.
They make us question those simple stories we tell ourselves.
Right.
And really grapple with the complicated reality of power and ideology and leadership,
Yeah.
especially in a world that's always changing.
Okay. We've covered a lot already.
We have
And trust me, there's still so much more to discuss.
lots to unpack.
So let's let this all sink in for a minute,
Yeah, take a breath.
and then we'll dive into the rest of this crazy interview.
Sounds good. So Gbagbo's pretty pragmatic,
Mm.
and that goes beyond just the Ivory Coast.
Okay.
He likes to give his opinion on global issues.
Right?
Some of them are pretty surprising.
You're telling me?
Yeah.
His take on the war in Ukraine really caught me off guard.
Yeah.
He compares it to the Cuban Missile Crisis
Wow.
and argues that Russia's actions are a direct response to NATO expanding eastward.
It's like he sees Putin as feeling trapped,
Right.
threatened, and then lashing out.
Yeah, it's definitely a controversial view.
It is.
But I've heard other people saying similar things.
Yeah, it's gaining some traction.
It seems like he's implying that the West is partly to blame for the conflict
Right.
by pushing NATO closer and closer to Russia.
Yeah, like they were provoking them.
It's a pretty bold statement,
It is.
and it goes against what a lot of people in the West believe. But I'm curious how Gbagbo reconciles this with his emphasis on African self-determination.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It seems kind of contradictory
It does.
to advocate for African nations to chart their own course
Yeah.
while seemingly justifying a powerful nation encroaching on another country's sovereignty.
I think maybe Gbagbo sees a difference
Okay.
between the historical context of colonialism in Africa
Yeah,
and the current situation between Russia and NATO.
right. It's a different dynamic.
Exactly. And he's very vocal about rejecting the label of Russian puppet.
Oh, yeah, I've heard people call him that.
Yeah, some of his opponents use that term.
Right.
But he's adamant that African nations need to stay independent
Okay.
and not be pressured by either side of this global power struggle.
So it's not about taking sides.
Yeah.
It's about Africa having a voice
Exactly.
in this world where there are multiple centers of power.
Right.
Where they don't have to choose between the East and the West.
Uh-huh.
It's like a call for a world where African voices actually matter.
Yeah, where they have equal weight with the traditional powers.
Right, and that ties into his vision of Pan-Africanism.
Yeah.
A unified Africa that can stand on its own.
Right.
Free from outside influence.
He also talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
And he's not afraid to be blunt.
I noticed that.
Yeah, he criticizes the UN for not creating a Palestinian state back in 1948 alongside Israel.
Right.
And he says that's the root of the conflict that's still going on today.
It's like he's saying the Palestinians were denied their basic right to self-determination.
Exactly, and that this historical injustice needs to be fixed.
So he's urging the UN and the international community to actually do something.
Yeah, to finally create a Palestinian state.
Not just talk about it.
Right. It's not about more negotiation.
It's about taking action.
Yeah, and righting a wrong.
The way he described the Palestinian experience as wandering really stuck with me.
Yeah, it's a powerful word.
It really captures the displacement and dispossession they've faced for so long.
It does.
You can tell that Gbagbo really feels for them.
Yeah, it's not just some abstract political issue for him.
Right, it's about the human cost of this unresolved conflict.
And that speaks to his broader view of justice and self-determination for everyone.
Not just in Africa.
For all people around the world.
It surprised me that he criticized La Francophonie.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, considering he's from a French-speaking country.
Right. You wouldn't expect that.
He doubts whether it's actually effective and questions what it's actually achieved.
He even says that he skipped all the Francophonie summits when he was president.
Really?
Yeah, he felt they were a waste of time.
Wow.
He basically calls it a talking shop.
Yeah.
All talk and no action.
I guess it represents for him the empty promises that Africa often gets from international organizations.
Right.
Okay, let's bring it back to the Ivory Coast.
All right.
And Gbagbo's plans for the future.
Okay.
He's definitely aiming for that 2025 presidential election.
He is.
And he's got some strategies for winning. He does.
He talks a lot about the need for electoral reform.
Yeah, fixing the voter roll.
Right, and making sure the Independent Electoral Commission is impartial.
Yeah, those are big issues.
They've been problems in Ivorian elections for years.
They have.
A lot of people think they need to be fixed.
Right.
To make sure the process is fair and democratic.
He knows it's going to be a crowded election.
Yeah.
There's lots of candidates.
Right.
But he's hopeful that the opposition can unite.
Okay.
Especially if it goes to a second round.
Yeah. Which seems likely.
With so many people running.
And that's where his political skills come in.
Right.
His ability to build alliances.
Yeah, even with people he disagrees with.
Remember, he'll work with anyone.
Yeah.
If it helps the Ivory Coast.
He does?
So even with that 20-year sentence for the BCEAO thing.
Yeah.
And all the political maneuvering of his opponents.
Right.
Gbagbo seems pretty confident that he can win.
It sounds like he's counting on his supporters.
Yeah, his base.
And the appeal of his message. Right? Ivorian sovereignty and Pan-African unity.
But it's a big question.
Yeah.
Whether he can overcome all those obstacles and convince enough people to buy into his vision.
It's a long shot.
It is.
But Gbagbo has defied the odds before.
That's true.
He's resilient.
He is.
And he knows how to connect with people.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with him or not.
Right.
Gbagbo is a major player in Ivorian politics.
A force to be reckoned with.
He reminds us that these simple stories about Africa often don't capture the complexity of the continent's political landscape.
Exactly.
What I find really interesting about Gbagbo is this tension between his desire for a unified and empowered Africa and his willingness to use tactics that some might see as morally questionable.
Right.
It's a paradox that makes him both fascinating and frustrating.
I agree. He embodies this struggle that exists in many post-colonial nations, this struggle to break free from outside influence, while also navigating the realities of power and politics in a globalized world. It's a struggle that plays out on so many levels. Individual, national, continental.
And Gbagbo's story gives us this unique insight into how complex this dynamic really is.
It does.
We've dug into Gbagbo's controversial past.
We have.
Looked at his provocative views on leadership. His vision for Africa.
And his bold takes on global issues.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle.
Oh, right.
His plans for the future of the Ivory Coast.
So that's where we'll go next.
Exactly. We're going to examine his concrete proposals for tackling the challenges facing the Ivory Coast. And his vision for a more sovereign and prosperous nation.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've gone through Laurent Gbagbo's past and his ideas about leadership and Pan-Africanism and even his views on global conflicts. But now let's look at what he wants for the future of the Ivory Coast. He's got some big goals, but are they actually possible?
Yeah, well, one of the main things he's worried about is the economic inequality in the Ivory Coast.
Right.
He talks about needing to move away from just exporting raw materials like cocoa and coffee because those prices can change a lot on the global market.
Yeah, so it makes the country vulnerable.
Exactly.
So he's not just talking about economic growth.
No.
He wants to diversify the economy.
Right.
Create more opportunities for Ivorians. And build a system that's more resilient.
Yeah, he wants to break away from that old colonial model of just extracting resources.
Right.
And move towards a future that's more sustainable and fair.
Makes sense.
Yeah, he really emphasizes investing in things like agriculture, manufacturing, and technology.
Okay.
He talks about creating an environment where people can start businesses and be innovative, especially young Ivorians.
So it's about giving them the power to build their own futures.
Exactly.
And contribute to the country's success.
He also talks about the need for better infrastructure.
Like roads and bridges and power grids.
Yeah, the basic stuff that a modern economy needs.
Right. He says it's not just about attracting foreign investment.
No.
It's about making life better for everyday Ivorians.
Connecting rural communities and creating a more integrated and prosperous nation.
It's about setting the stage for sustainable development.
Right. Making sure that economic growth actually benefits everyone in society.
And he's definitely aware of the social problems in the Ivory Coast.
Yeah, those deep divisions that have developed over the years.
He keeps coming back to this idea of national reconciliation.
Right, healing the wounds of the past.
Yeah, and building a more inclusive and unified Ivorian identity.
That's a big challenge.
It is, especially with the country's history of political violence and ethnic tensions.
He thinks education is a key part of this.
Okay.
He wants to reform the education system to encourage critical thinking, tolerance, and a shared understanding of Ivorian history and culture.
So it's about giving future generations the tools to overcome these divisions.
Right, and build a more cohesive society.
But it's not just about changing attitudes.
No.
It's about dealing with the systemic inequalities that cause these divisions.
Yeah, Gbagbo talks about land reform.
Making sure everyone has access to land and resources.
Right, regardless of their ethnicity or political affiliation.
He sees this as crucial for economic empowerment and social justice.
He argues that if you don't address these root causes of inequality, true reconciliation won't happen.
But Gbagbo's vision goes beyond just the Ivory Coast.
Right.
He's a strong believer in Pan-Africanism.
Yes.
And he sees a strong and prosperous Ivory Coast as essential for a stronger and more unified Africa.
He talks about increasing regional cooperation, strengthening economic ties, and working together to solve shared problems like climate change and security threats.
So it's about using their combined power to achieve common goals.
Exactly, creating a more influential and self-reliant Africa on the world stage.
But there are definitely some big obstacles to overcome.
Yeah, we've already talked about the legal and political challenges. But there are also those deep-rooted economic and social problems
that will need some creative solutions.
Exactly.
It's unclear if Gbagbo, even if he wins the presidency, will be able to actually make these changes happen.
And we can't forget about the influence of outside factors.
Right.
Global economic trends, geopolitical shifts, and the power of other nations.
All of that will affect the Ivory Coast's path.
Gbagbo's story shows how resilient people can be. His ability to adapt and his unwavering belief in his vision for a better future.
Whether you like his methods or agree with his ideology, he's definitely had huge impact on Ivorian politics.
He has.
And the conversation about Africa's place in the world.
Gbagbo is a complicated and controversial figure.
Yeah, no doubt.
But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
He's a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, he makes us really think about the complexities of African politics.
He does.
And move beyond those simple narratives.
To engage with the continent's many different voices and perspectives.
This deep dive has just scratched the surface of Gbagbo's story.
Yeah, just a glimpse.
We've looked at his past,
Uh-huh.
analyzed his beliefs, and seen a bit of his vision for the future.
But it's up to you to dig deeper.
Yeah.
Form your own opinions.
Right.
And think about what his journey tells us about the challenges and opportunities facing the Ivory Coast and the whole African continent.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Laurent Gbagbo.